Brand of the Fetters, by Edward Leonard, author of In Confidence from the Dead, Detective Story Magazine, June 1930. His punishment was constant fear. Chapter 1. Through the Storm. Behind time and in a furious hurry, the Royal Limited, crack train of the line, was flashing through a black night of heavy, wind-driven rain. Up from the river valleys to the south, it had fought its way over the long grades in the teeth of a howling gale, and now the thundering roar of its swift advance was reverberating through pine-clad mountains. Those lonely heights were completely hidden in the dense darkness, except now and then at bends of the road, when to the men in the cab of the locomotive, the long, searching glare of the headlight illumined steep, storm-swept slopes. The night was half gone. In the sleepers, the berths had been made up long ago, and most of them were occupied. In the club smoker, which had been well filled earlier in the night, only 3 passengers remained. Presumably, they were either fond of late hours or were not going through to Montreal, where the train was due early in the morning. One of the 3, sprawled out in his leather-padded armchair, his pipe growing cold in his hand, had dropped into snoring slumber. The 2 others, still wide awake, were seated facing each other across the width of the cozy, brightly lit car. They could hear the rain pounding on the iron roof and swishing madly against the windows. One of them, long-limbed, broad-shouldered, sun-browned, with a big sapphire in his tie, was placidly smoking a cigar. The other, smartly dressed, dark, slender, extremely handsome, was being served with mineral water by the Negro porter. As he raised a slim white hand and grasped the long glass, tinkling with ice, his cuff slipped back and revealed a gold watch fastened to his wrist with a broad, decorative blue strap. At that moment, a wizened, grey-haired passenger, with the brim of a soft hat pulled down over his eyes, came slowly and with uncertain steps from the narrow entrance passage beside the buffet kitchen. The man with the wristwatch cast the approaching figure an indifferent glance, which suddenly developed into a wide-eyed, curious stare. The glass slipped from his fingers and crashed on the floor. The accident seemed to jar the nerves of the old fellow who had just entered. His feeble-looking eyes blinked nervously from behind steel-rimmed spectacles. Apparently his sight was too poor to see just what had happened, and the crash close to his feet had confused him. As he drew back from the scattered pieces of glass, the speeding train gave a lurch that threw him off his balance. He fell forward, his head struck heavily against the arm of a chair, and he crumpled unconscious on the floor. The man with the sapphire pin sprang to his assistance. The snores of the sleeper in the chair a few feet away ceased abruptly, and opening his eyes, he looked at the prostrate figure with languid interest. The man with the wristwatch rose slowly to his feet with a bewildered frown. On his knees on the floor, the man with the sapphire proceeded to examine the silent, motionless form beside him. "Nothing very serious," he announced at last. "His heart's pumping all right. He'll come out of his trance pretty soon. A mean little bump on his head, that's all. Porter, bring some ice." As he waited for the porter to return, he noticed that one of the unconscious man's hands was scratched and bleeding. Little slivers of broken glass were sticking into the palm. Carefully he picked them out, and looking for more, rolled back the sleeve of his patient's undershirt, a sleeve so unusually long that it had come way down to the joint of the wounded hand. A startled expression came into his eyes, and he gave a prolonged stare of amazement at the wrist he had exposed. Completely encircling that wrist was an old, livid scar. For a long moment, it seemed to hold him spellbound. Then, slowly, he covered it with the sleeve as the porter came back with the ice. Presently, while the ice was being rubbed over his forehead, the patient opened his eyes and looked up bewildered into the sun-browned face bending over him. After a moment, he made an effort to rise. "I'm all right," he whispered, breathing hard. "Dizzy, that's all. If you can walk, you'd better go to your berth," advised the man with the sapphire, helping him to his feet. "I'll help you to get back there if you say so." The other sank into a chair. "No, I get out at the next stop," he explained, speaking with difficulty. I came here thinking I'd just have time for a smoke. Don't have to go back. My bag's on the platform." After pulling out his handkerchief and wrapping it around the scratches on his hand, he again closed his eyes. "Couple of minutes rest and I'll be all right," he murmured. The porter proceeded to pick up pieces of glass from the floor. The snoring passenger fell asleep again. The man with the sapphire and the man with the wristwatch strolled away toward the other end of the car and seated themselves together. "Did you see that mark on his wrist?" the man with the sapphire inquired softly. "Yes," was the low-voiced reply. "Strange, wasn't it? You noticed, I suppose, that it ran completely around his wrist. What did you make of it?" "Nothing. Did you?" "I wondered," said the man with the sapphire slowly, "if it could be the mark of a handcuff." From the corners of his eyes, his companion shot a furtive glance at him. Would a handcuff bite so deep as to leave a scar like that? It's possible. When I was a mine boss in Arizona, I heard of such a case. 2 prisoners handcuffed together were on their way to serve their terms. One of them, middle-aged but with no previous criminal record, had been given 20 years for killing his former business partner, whom he accused of robbing and ruining him. The other prisoner, though only about half as old as his companion, was as smooth a swindler as ever drifted into the West. They were about to get into the car that was to take them to prison, when the younger one snatched with his free hand the revolver of the officer in charge of them and knocked him senseless. The unarmed driver was forced out, and the prisoners escaped with the car. But the alarm had been spread so quickly that there had been no time to search the officer for the key to the handcuffs. Far out on a hot, waterless desert, the car broke down. Abandoning the car, and afraid of meeting some searching party on the road, they set out across trackless country. They carried not a drop of water, and perhaps you can imagine what happened. The man with the wristwatch scowled. "I think I can," he muttered with a shrug. 3 days later they came to a shack where an old prospector was living alone, the man with the sapphire continued. They were raving in delirium and crying out for water. For hours they had been struggling in frenzy to free themselves from the galling fetters, which had grown as hot as the burning sands. In their insane efforts to drag off the tight bracelets, the steel had worn through the skin and then deep into the flesh as the tortured, inflamed wrists swelled. But in spite of the agony of it, they were continuing like maniacs to break loose. The prospector, after giving them water and bringing them back to their senses, managed to file off the handcuffs. Not having done so would have been inhuman cruelty. He did not discover, until too late to do anything about it, that the younger one had a revolver in his pocket. They forced him to provide them with a burro, a food supply, and canteens, and to let them go free. But he knew they were marked men, marked for life where the rings of steel had bitten through the swollen, bleeding flesh to the bone. "And what became of them?" inquired the man with the wristwatch. "I don't know. They were never caught. I was told that the older one had a wife and a small child, a girl, who not long afterward disappeared from their home. I suppose they joined him somewhere." The man with the wristwatch, glancing down the car, observed that the victim of the accident had twisted around in his chair and was peering through a rain-swept window. It seemed as if he must be watching for lights. Surely he could have hoped to see nothing else in that black night. "We must be getting pretty close to the old fellow's town," the man with the sapphire remarked. The whistle of the Royal Limited sent a long-drawn screech into the storm. They heard the hiss of the air brakes. "I've got to get my bag," the man with the wristwatch announced, rising from his chair. "I get off at the next stop." His companion looked up at him with a puzzled frown. "I thought I heard you telling the conductor you were ticketed for Montreal. I've changed my mind." Hurriedly he made his way out of the car. Presently arriving at his berth, he took possession of a big Gladstone bag, a cane, a soft hat, and a light summer raincoat. He put on the coat and hat, took a firm grip on the stick, which seemed like a futile appendage on such a night, and ordered the porter to carry the bag to the door. When, a few moments later, the train stopped at the station, he got out, took the bag from the porter, tipped him generously, and, catching sight of the grey-haired victim of the accident, proceeded to follow him through the waiting room and out onto a platform in the rear. Here, a stage was waiting. The driver, standing beside it, cast a friendly grin of recognition at the grey-haired arrival. "Right here waiting for you, Mr. Sherwood," he said, taking his bag and helping him into the car. "Where do you go?" The man with the wristwatch sternly demanded of the driver. "To Northborough." "How far is that?" 10 miles. "That's where I'm going." "Plenty of room inside," the driver informed him. A sudden gust of wind drove a deluge of rain into the covered platform. The man with the wristwatch, glad to find a refuge from it, stepped hurriedly into the car, where he found a seat among several passengers. The grey-haired man from the club smoker, seated facing him, showed no sign of recognition. His weak-looking eyes were blinking behind his spectacles. His handkerchief was still wound over his wounded hand, where the long sleeve of his undershirt peeped out under the cuff of his overcoat. The strange scar was completely hidden. It was his right hand that had been cut by the broken glass, therefore it was on his right wrist that the scar had been revealed. This was a detail that had not escaped the notice of the cold, steady eyes that were now studying him. For a few moments, the stage passed through dimly lighted streets. Then the black night closed in around it as it left the town. The man with the wristwatch became absorbed in his thoughts. He pondered the scrap of information that chance had given him about the grey-haired man since leaving the train. So his name was Sherwood, he mused, and he was not a stranger here. The rain beat furiously against the windows. They were traveling rough mountain roads, where sometimes the grades seemed perilously steep. Almost half an hour passed before he came out of his abstraction. Then he discovered that they were again in dimly lighted streets. He raised his left wrist, looked at his watch, and frowned. It was very late. Apparently they had arrived in Northborough. At short intervals the car stopped to let passengers off at their homes. The victim of the accident in the club smoker, apparently almost himself again, got out in front of a cozy, isolated little house, raised a big umbrella, and, lugging his bag, fought his way through wind and rain up the garden path. Before long, the man with the wristwatch was the only remaining passenger. "Where do you go, brother?" the driver inquired. "To the best hotel I can find," was the sharp reply. "That'll be the Pine Tree Tavern, a pretty classy place. Then take me there. By the way, there was a man named Sherwood who came up on the train with me. Do you know him?" "Know him well. He's the proprietor of the biggest store in this village. He goes down to Boston 2 or 3 times a year to buy stock. That's where he's come from now, I guess." "A storekeeper, eh? Is he making a good living at it?" "You can bet your life he is. Why, stranger, I happen to know he's got $20,000 out on mortgages right here in Northborough, and they say he's the biggest depositor the Northborough bank's got." A smile lit the handsome face of the lone passenger. It lingered faintly on his lips until he arrived at his destination. As the stranger stepped into the lobby of the Pine Tree Tavern, the sleepy, round red face of Rufus Bagley, the proprietor, who had been sitting up for the stage, appeared behind the office desk. "Can I get a room and bath here?" the stranger inquired, stepping up to the open register and selecting a pen from the rack. "Several of them," Bagley informed him, and quoted the prices. "The best you've got," said the stranger, and he wrote on the register, "Archibald Ely Nash, New York." Bagley, carrying the bag, led him upstairs to the next floor and to a room which the new arrival looked over with sharply appraising eyes. "This will do," he decided presently. And then, pleasantly aware of the fact that he had not been asked for a payment, he added, "I'm likely to be here for some time." As soon as he was alone, Archibald Ely Nash proceeded to prepare himself for bed. After a few moments he paused in his shirt sleeves in front of the bureau and studied himself in the mirror. It always pleased him to note how well he had kept his youth. So far as his appearance was concerned, the years had been good to him. He could have passed as no more than 30, though he was several years older than that. Slowly he unfastened the broad strap of his watch from his left wrist. For a moment he paused and listened to the storm beating at the windows. Then, as if with sudden bitter recollections, he stared with brooding eyes at the place where the strap had covered. Completely encircling that exposed wrist was a scar, such a scar as he had seen on the right wrist of the unconscious man in the club smoker of the Royal Limited. Chapter 2. Beneath the Mask. The handsome stranger who had registered at the Pine Tree Tavern the night before as Archibald Ely Nash of New York stepped out from the lobby into the cool, brisk air of a September day. The storm had passed, and the sun was shining. Pausing, he cast a keenly observant glance at a group of young women seated on the broad veranda. For an instant, an almost imperceptible smile flickered on his lips, as if he were fully conscious of the fact that every one of them was regarding him with critical and absorbing interest. The season was drawing to an end at Northborough, and most of the young men at the summer colony had gone. At such a time, when the tavern was inhabited mostly by mothers and their daughters and a few old fellows no longer hampered by business ties, the arrival of Archibald Ely Nash, who to feminine eyes was as alluring as a movie hero, had naturally produced a mild sensation. There was a general impression that he must be a person of social position and means. Not only his appearance and his manner, but even his name was impressive. It is surprising what a difference it makes when a man uses all three of his names, if he happens to have that number. Instead of being content with just two and a middle initial, Archibald Ely Nash had discovered that Shakespeare was wrong when he scoffingly asked, "What's in a name?" and that there could be magic in names sometimes, and, at present, he needed all the magic he could conjure to offset the grim fact, known only to himself, that the $5 bill nesting in a pocket of his vest was all the money he had in the world. For a time he had felt that fortune might have something in store for him in New York, but his adventures there had been unfortunate, particularly with the police, and he had decided that Canada offered him more safety. Then on the Royal Limited, he had caught sight of a face that had startled him. He had stared at it doubtfully. If it was the face of a man who had suddenly risen out of his memory, it had changed so much as to make recognition uncertain. And then he saw the strange scar on the man's wrist. After that, he no longer doubted. As he stood lingering on the veranda of the Pine Tree Tavern, he betrayed not the least indication of his straitened circumstances. His natty blue suit, immaculate white spats over brand-new shoes, pearl-grey hat of expensive velour with its brim turned down rakishly over his left eye, fine linen, modish tie, and a yellow Malacca cane with an amber crook were certainly not the accessories of destitution. The young women in the porch chairs stared at him fascinated. This gorgeous stranger with his slender, beautifully proportioned figure, finely modelled features, clear, white skin, and carefully groomed dark hair was the most pleasing sight that had appeared before their eyes all that summer. But as befitted a man with only $5 to his name and a growing hotel bill, he turned his back upon them presently and passed on down the veranda steps and along the path that led to the tree-lined main street of the village. His handsome face showed not a care. Desperate circumstances he had faced before many a time. Behind him was an adventurous career that had been long enough to teach him many ways of wriggling out of trouble. It would have taken something a good deal more serious than mere shortage of money to disturb the magnificent poise of Archibald Ely Nash. A short walk brought him into the business district of the village. Here were a few small stores, a post office, and a bank. Northborough, tucked in a fold of the hills, was a thriving little place. Farmers came in from all over the township to buy their supplies, and in summer the high, dry air and the beauty of nearby mountains filled the tavern with prosperous visitors. Across the street from the bank, the big show windows of a two-story frame building exhibited a wide variety of goods. Over the doorway was a conspicuous sign: Sherwood's General Store. Archibald Ely Nash stopped in front of the sign and looked in through the windows. It was a slack hour, and the place seemed to be deserted. Jauntily swinging his cane, he stepped inside. For a moment, he believed he was alone, and looking about, he studied the place with keen interest. Here, crowded into one big room, it seemed as if there must be everything a customer could possibly want, everything from millinery to farm tools. Presently, a soft voice broke the silence. "Is there something I can show you?" A girl had come into view from behind stacks of dry goods and was addressing him from one of the counters. She was attractive enough to draw his most engaging smile as he stepped over to her. On closer observation, he thought he detected in her comely face a faint resemblance to the man he had come to see. "Something tells me you are Seth Sherwood's daughter," he remarked. His familiar advances met with no encouragement. "Then something tells you the truth," she returned brusquely. But he had stirred her curiosity, and she was studying him with sharp interest. He was of a type that had never attracted her. For her years, she was a keen judge of character, and she decided there was something about this stranger that she did not like. It seemed to her that that handsome, beguiling face was like a mask for something evil and menacing. For a moment, his cold grey eyes held her spellbound. Never before had she seen a man with eyes so utterly lacking in human feeling. They were as soulless as the eyes of a cat. With sudden resentment of her unfriendly attitude, his manner stiffened. "I came here to see your father," he announced grimly. The girl pointed to an open door in the rear. "You'll find him back there in the office." The caller made his way into the little rear room, and finding Seth Sherwood alone there at his desk, closed the door. The storekeeper, who, to judge from the closeness with which he had been holding his spectacled eyes to the open pages of a ledger, was very near-sighted, swung around in his swivel chair, and stared up at the intruder reproachfully. "Who told you to close that door?" he demanded. He seemed to be very little the worse for the accident of the night before. There was a slight bruise on his forehead, and strips of court plaster covered the few slight cuts on his right hand. "So you don't remember me?" said the caller with a smile. "The last time we saw each other until last night, we were a good 2,000 miles from here. That was 12 years ago." The storekeeper's eyes widened. "You've made a mistake," he gasped. "I never saw you before. I was never 2,000 miles from here in my life." "You can't fool me, Sherwin," the dapper visitor persisted. "You've changed your name a trifle, and you've grown pretty old. But you're the same bird, all right." The visitor drew nearer, and his voice sank to a whisper. "We separated on the edge of a desert. We were hunted men, you and I. For you, 20 years in prison was waiting. I've made no mistake about you. Last night in the club car of the train, I saw plainly the mark of the nippers on your wrist." For several tense seconds, the storekeeper did not speak. Suddenly, he rose from his chair, stepped close to his visitor, and peered into his face with a long, searching look. "Dupree," he muttered under his breath. "Joe Dupree. Right, but while I'm in Northborough, my name is Nash." There was a prolonged silence, while Seth Sherwood stood staring at his visitor dubiously. The years rolled back. With the eyes of his imagination, the grey-haired man saw again the glaring desert sands and the blistering sun flaring red in a brazen sky. Once more, he felt fettering steel burning into his swollen flesh. He shuddered as he tried to draw his thoughts away from a chapter of his life he had been trying for 12 years to forget. "I never expected to see you again, Joe," he said at last. The visitor's gaze wandered around the little office. "I hear the world's been pretty good to you since we left each other 12 years ago," he said sullenly. "I don't know that it has." The storekeeper returned with a touch of bitterness. "My wife died the year after we came here. I don't get much out of life except worry. For all those 12 years, fear. I've been living in fear, Dupree. I never let fear bother me," said the visitor with a shrug. If I were as well fixed as you are, Sherwood, I'd never worry about anything at all. But luck don't seem to like me. Through all those years, I've been stepping out of one trouble into another. In fact, I'm in trouble right now. What kind of trouble this time, Joe? Oh, nothing very serious. Broke, that's all. I thought that perhaps you could oblige me with a loan. The storekeeper screwed up his wizened face as if in sudden pain. I'm pretty hard up myself, Joe, he parried after a moment of deep thought. I have to watch the pennies pretty close to make both ends meet. How much do you want? $1,000, was the prompt reply. $1,000, Seth Sherwood cried. Why, Joe, how could I ever raise $1,000? A poor country storekeeper like me. Your check would be good for that much at any time across the street at the bank, Archibald Ely Nash insisted. I hear this store of yours is a gold mine, and that you own mortgages all over the village. I've learned a good deal about your affairs since I drifted into Northborough. You've been hearing a lot of fool gossip, Sherwood protested. To let you have $1,000 would start me on the road to bankruptcy. Joe Dupree, alias Archibald Ely Nash, gazed reflectively at the amber crook of his cane. Oh well, he sighed after a moment. I suppose I'll have to raise the ducats somewhere else. And, moving slowly toward the door, he added, I guess I'll go out and have a chat with your daughter. Maybe she'll be interested to hear me talk about the old times in the West. Wait, cried the storekeeper, his voice shrill with excitement. You're not going to mention that old trouble of mine to Lorna? Lorna? Queried Nash. Is that your daughter's name? You mean she doesn't know? She was too young to know. She was only 8 years old at the time of the trouble. She's never found out about it. Nash, who had been a little doubtful on that point, pondered the information silently. He had heard at the tavern that Seth Sherwood, though an influential citizen of the village, was generally regarded as a miserly skinflint with a heart for nobody in the world but his daughter. Presently, he turned away from the door and fastened on the storekeeper a look that made the dried-up old man tremble. The evil that lurked beneath the handsome, alluring mask was revealing itself clearly now. The cold grey eyes of Joe Dupree were merciless. Do I get the 1,000, Seth Sherwood? He inquired softly. Or do you want me to talk to your daughter about the old days and then send the tip out to a certain place in the West that a runaway prisoner wanted there to serve a 20-year sentence for homicide is one of the leading citizens of Northborough? The old man, feeling himself becoming enmeshed in that dreadful torturing thing, the net of a blackmailer, was desperately trying to save himself. He was almost beaten, but there was still a little fight left in him. You're a wanted man yourself, he cried. If they take me back there, you go too. I don't think so, the other returned calmly. I'm footloose. I could drop out of sight pretty quick. It wouldn't be from Northborough that I'd send the tip out there. I'd wait until I was in a safer place. But you can't drop out of sight, Seth Sherwood, not unless you give up your home and your daughter and your business. The storekeeper pressed a quivering hand to his perspiring forehead. He realized at last that he was trapped, helpless. To save himself, he would have been willing to part with a good deal more than $1,000, but he knew what blackmail meant. Neither $1,000 nor twice that much was going to get him out of the net. This man would come again and again, always asking for more, and eventually would ruin him. I'll try to raise the money for you, Joe, he stammered at last. When do I get it? The visitor demanded sharply. I can't just say. In a few days, perhaps. It's going to be hard work raising it. I want it now. Go over to the bank and draw it. I'll wait here. But I haven't got that much there, the storekeeper protested. You've got to give me time, not an hour, and the bank will be closing pretty soon. Get a move on yourself, Sherwood. Archibald Ely Nash had felt almost certain that Seth Sherwood's bank account was more than enough to meet his demand. And that he was not mistaken became evident when the storekeeper, realizing the futility of further protests, picked up a checkbook from his desk and went out of the office. A moment later, as he passed through the store, Lorna Sherwood was startled by the haunted look in his eyes and his agitated manner. "Why, father, what's the matter?" she exclaimed. "Nothing, nothing at all, Lorna," he answered hoarsely. "Everything's all right." But Lorna knew that everything was not all right, and she was convinced that the handsome stranger in the office had brought bad news. Deeply puzzled, she looked out through one of the show windows and watched her father cross the street and enter the bank. Soon he was back, hurrying past her without a word and returning to his office, where immediately he closed the door. It was very seldom the office door was closed, and she felt sure that something of a particularly secretive nature must be going on there. A few minutes passed. Then the stranger came out alone. He was swinging his cane jauntily, and he was smiling. It was strange, she mused, that a bearer of bad news should look so self-satisfied and cheerful. Chapter 3. Poor Man and Heiress. Late in the afternoon of the following day, Archibald Ely Nash, no longer facing destitution, but with $1,000 added to the $5 bill, which had been the extent of his financial resources 24 hours, earlier was sunning himself on the veranda of the Pine Tree Tavern when a particularly smart runabout carrying a young man and a girl drew up at the end of the lawn. The car could be easily recognized as one of the most expensive makes in the market, and this evidence of wealth stirred Nash's interest at once. The young couple stepped out and made their way up to the hotel. The girl was a tall, slender, stylish blonde. Her companion a rugged, athletic type, square-jawed, rough-featured. As they came up the steps, the girl caught sight of Nash, and observing that he was watching her admiringly and that he was the handsomest man she had seen all summer, she gave him a smile, which he was quick to return. As she and her companion entered the hotel, Nash rose from his chair and followed them, ignoring the office, where on the counter the register lay open for new arrivals. The couple passed on through the lobby and into the tea room. The entrancing smile the girl had bestowed upon him had quickened Nash's interest. From behind the office desk appeared the round, red face of Rufus Bagley, the tavern's proprietor, and Nash strolled over to him in quest of information. "Do you happen to know who the girl is who passed through here just now?" he inquired. "That's Andrew J. Marland's daughter," Bagley informed him. Marland. The name was unfamiliar to Nash. "You never heard of Andrew J. Marland?" said Bagley with a look of surprise. "Why, he's the Woolen King. Owns a whole manufacturing town down near Boston. He was born up here in Northborough in the same house where he spends his summers now. You must have noticed the place. Big white house up on the hill 1/2 mile east of here. A good many acres of private estate with a brick and cement wall running around them. He's fixed the old house over considerably since he made his pile, and he's added a couple of wings to it. I understand the daughter finds Northborough too slow for her, but she can't get the old man to go anywhere else." "And the man who's with her?" Nash persisted. "Not her husband, is he?" Bagley grinned. "Not so lucky. He's only the man who wants to be her husband. They're supposed to be engaged, but that don't mean much to Jane Marland. She's been engaged 2 or 3 times before. Lefty Burke won't be sure of her till they're married, which isn't liable to happen, the old man being dead set against it. He's so sore he won't even let Lefty come to the house. That's why they drift in here for tea every day or two." Turning his eyes to the doorway of the tea room, through which he caught a glimpse of the young couple who had seated themselves at one of the tables, Nash began to ruminate deeply over what he had just learned. "Nice car out there," he remarked after a moment. "That Burke's?" "Lefty's? Gosh, no, that's Jane Marland's. Lefty couldn't afford a car like that. He had to scratch around pretty lively to raise the cash for a second-hand flivver. I ain't saying he isn't all right, but he's not in the Marland class. Old Marland's ambitious for his daughter, wants her to marry somebody high up in the world. Lefty came from poor folks, and he's had a hard row to hoe. Nice enough young fellow, lots of push to him. Went to college, pitched for the college team. That's where he got his name. A left-handed twirler. Between you and me, I don't believe Jane Marland cares much about him, but attractive young men happen to be scarce around here this summer, and Lefty made the best of his opportunities. And what does this bird do for a living? Said Nash. Oh, he's got a little office up the road, sells village lots, farms and insurance, or tries to. He's got a cheap room here at the tavern. Stroking his chin with his soft, manicured fingers, Nash gave an ironic smile. It would be quite a rise in the world for this Lefty Burke if he married Jane Marland, eh? Especially when the old man died. How many millions will she get? Quite a number, returned Bagley vaguely. She's the only child and her mother's dead. Suddenly, in Nash's agile mind, ambition began to stir as never before. Jane Marland, heiress to millions, had smiled at him. At least, to that extent, he had attracted her. He was fully aware of his own charms. He knew the flutter of excitement he had stirred among the girls at the tavern. They were calling him Adonis, as he had learned from overhearing scraps of conversation not intended for his ears. And a library dictionary had informed him that Adonis was a youth so beautiful and alluring that the goddesses fought over him. It would be an easy game, he mused to himself. A game that would be safe, win or lose. And something tells me I wouldn't lose. But a disturbing thought brought a little pucker into his forehead. There would be Andrew J. Marland to be reckoned with. If the old man objected so strenuously to Lefty Burke, what would he do if he discovered the unknown, mysterious Archibald Ely Nash suing for his daughter's hand? Here was a serious difficulty indeed, yet there might be some way of overcoming it. With this perplexing problem in his resourceful mind, he began to stroll slowly up and down the lobby, his head bowed in thought. He was still there when, half an hour later, Jane Marland and Lefty Burke came out of the tea room. The girl noticed Nash at once, and again she smiled at him, even more graciously than before. The interchange of flirtatious glances between the two was so obvious that it failed to escape Burke's attention. His eyes flashed wrathfully. "See here, Jane," he growled loudly enough for Nash to overhear. "I noticed what passed between you and that cheap Romeo out on the veranda. And now you're at it again. Haven't you any sense at all? You don't know anything about the fellow. He may be a bad one." "Jealous, Lefty," she teased. Burke was too angry to trust his voice. He turned a truculent glare at the handsome stranger, and with the girl beside him passed on. The incident left Nash unruffled. With a self-satisfied smile, he turned to a window and watched the pair get into the runabout and drive away. What a chance, he mused. Millions of dollars waiting for the guy that gets that girl, and nobody in the way except that poor stiff Lefty Burke. But for the moment, he had forgotten Andrew J. Marland. "I'll play the game," he decided. "I've got a strong hunch that someday Jane Marland is going to become Mrs. Archibald Ely Nash." Chapter 4. Rivals. Being in no need of money at present, Nash remained away from the victim who had so reluctantly parted with $1,000. But now and then, he cast a reflective eye on the general store across the way from the bank. He felt a sense of ownership in the place. Its usually brisk business pleased him. He was confident that he could go in there and collect the profits whenever he might choose. Once, he spoke to Lorna Sherwood on the street, and she cut him dead. The incident made him wonder whether she had discovered what he had done to her father. It seemed improbable that she knew, but she had made her dislike for Nash very plain. That, however, did not worry him in the least. Lorna Sherwood occupied only a small place in his thoughts. There was only one girl in Northborough he was thinking much about at present, and that was Jane Marland. He strolled out to the hill east of the village and took a look at the Marland house and its well-kept acres. The idea that he himself might sometime own or at least share in that fine estate gave him a thrill. But again and again, Andrew J. Marland had come into his mind as a formidable obstacle to his ambition. Marland had been pointed out to him on the street, and Nash had observed with a good deal of satisfaction that the Woolen King, a grim, sharp-eyed man, was getting old and feeble. What a stroke of fortune his death, if it did not come too late, would be to the crooked adventurer who was after his daughter. On the fickle, susceptible Jane Marland, the Adonis of the tavern had made, on their first sight of each other, even more of an impression than he suspected. She was fond of Lefty and had been taking her engagement to him rather seriously. In fact, her father's stern opposition to the match had helped Burke's cause instead of hurting it, for Jane was a girl who chafed under restraint, and she might marry Lefty just to show that she was her own boss, if for no other reason. But the idea of carrying on a flirtation with the handsome stranger at the tavern was appealing and stirred all her romantic impulses. She decided to give him an opportunity of making her acquaintance, and 2 days after the incident that had aroused Lefty's jealousy, she went to the tavern alone, choosing a time when usually Lefty was away on business. It was there, in the spacious lounge room, that Nash discovered her. She was seated at the big center table looking over the magazines. As he came strolling slowly toward her, she looked up at him and smiled charmingly. "I feel as if we were already old friends," said Nash with cool self-assurance. "You remember, perhaps, that we have seen each other before, though not under such agreeable circumstances." "But I don't even know your name," she protested. He proceeded to introduce himself. "I have been hoping for this opportunity," he told her softly, "but I was afraid I was never going to find it. Now that it has come, it seems too good to be true." Jane Marland laughed at him. "It seems to me you are a little sudden," she said. "Do you say such nice things to every girl you meet for the first time?" "You may not believe it, but girls have seldom interested me," he answered solemnly. "Until I saw you here the other day, I was heart-free and glad of it. But the whole world has changed for me since then." "Really?" she said with a twinkle of amusement in her eyes. "How nice of you to say so. I don't suppose you mean a word of it, but it's a relief to find in this dull town a man who knows how to talk." "It is dull, isn't it?" he admitted. "I don't know why I came here. I was going to get out after the first day, and then I saw you." "Oh, so you've been staying on just on my account?" "For no other reason." Jane Marland leaned back in her chair and laughed softly. The Adonis of the tavern was surpassing all her expectations of him, but though she seemed to be merely amused by him, she would have been glad to discover that she could take his words seriously. She could not recall that she had ever met quite such a charming man. If she should find he was really in earnest in his apparent devotion. She was beginning to feel already that Lefty Burke would have a formidable rival for her affections. "It's tea time, isn't it?" he remarked a few minutes later. "Suppose we go and see what the tavern has to offer." They went into the tea room and seated themselves at one of the little tables. They had been there only a short time when Lefty Burke appeared in the lobby and looked in at them. Lefty was a picture of suppressed fury. He could hardly restrain himself. He had seen enough to know that the handsome stranger was making a strong impression upon Jane Marland. But he did not go into the tea room, and presently, finding the hotel unendurable under the circumstances, he went out and made his way to his office. There, alone with bitter thoughts, he remained for an hour. "I guess it's about time I had an interview with that bird," he decided at last, and seething with anger, he returned to the tavern. Jane Marland had gone, and out on the veranda Nash was sitting alone. Lefty stepped up to him with menace in his eyes. "Nash, I want you to keep away from Miss Marland," he announced abruptly. "You're a stranger here. She knows nothing about you. You've never even been introduced to her as far as I can learn. You had an unholy nerve to even speak to her. If she wasn't just a spoiled child, she wouldn't have had anything to do with you." Nash rose to his feet. "I don't think I need any advice from you," he said scornfully. "It seems to me you're acting like a fool. Miss Marland is old enough to take care of herself without your interference." "Are you going to keep away from her or not?" Lefty persisted. "Emphatically not, if she wants to see me." "I happen to be engaged to marry Miss Marland," Lefty explained. "Then I'm sorry for her," said Nash with a shrug. Suddenly losing control of himself, Lefty swung a fist at him savagely. Staggering back from a heavy blow on the jaw, Archibald Ely Nash saw stars. He barely saved himself from falling, Regaining his balance, he stood staring at Lefty with venomous hatred. "It's lucky for you I'm not packing a gun," he hissed between his teeth. "So you're a gunfighter, eh?" Lefty growled at him. "I knew you were some kind of a crook. It shows all over you. I guess I'll have to watch out for myself, or I'll feel a knife in my back some dark night." Turning away, he left Nash to nurse his hate. And Nash was a man whose hate was dangerous. There was an evil, inhuman glare in his eyes now that would have been terrible to see. Chapter 5. Struck down in the dark. When Nash finally regained his composure, he began to realize that he was in a very awkward situation. Jane Marland had promised a call on the afternoon of the next day to take him out in her car and show him some of the mountain scenery. If Burke should see them together again, there would almost certainly be more trouble, perhaps another blow to the jaw. Nash knew that in a fist fight, he would have no chance against Lefty, and he dreaded another encounter with him. How was he going to continue his attentions to Jane while avoiding Burke's vengeance? It was a problem for which he could find no immediate solution. However, he was certain he would not surrender to Burke's demands. He fully intended to see the heiress to Marland's millions whenever the opportunity might offer itself. But fate was bringing an answer to his problem more quickly than he could have imagined. Fate was on the telegraph wire the next morning, sending a message to Marland. The Woolen King learned that business made his presence at a certain directors' meeting in San Francisco of pressing necessity. To get there in time, he would have to leave Northborough early the following morning. To provide himself with money for the trip, Marland went to the bank soon after receiving the message. He drew out $1,500 in $50 bills, fresh from the treasury. As he was slipping the money into a pocketbook, he happened to cross paths with Nash. Nash noticed Marland standing on the bank's step with the money in his hands. He could see it was quite a sizable wad of large denominations. More than once in his varied career, such a display of money had tempted Nash to theft, but there was no temptation now. He could provide for all his needs without any risk simply by calling on Seth Sherwood. However, Marland always held his interest, so Nash watched as the old man crossed the street and entered Sherwood's store. Nash continued on his way to the tavern. Inside the store, Marland found Lorna Sherwood ready to serve him. "You carry most everything here, don't you?" he asked. "I need a small traveling bag, easy to carry. The only small ones I've got are in my house in Boston, and I have to leave for the West Coast first thing in the morning." Lorna found a bag that suited him, and since Marland never liked to run accounts in local stores, he offered one of his new $50 bills in payment. "Sorry, it's the smallest I've got," he explained. "A nice fresh one, just drew it out of the bank. Knew they wouldn't be open at the hour I've got to leave in the morning." Lorna slipped the bill into the cash register and gave him the change. Marland, carrying his new bag, returned to his home on the hill. In the middle of the afternoon, Jane drove her smart runabout to the tavern, where she found Nash waiting for her. His handsome face was unmarked by the blow Lefty had given him the day before. It wasn't until they were out of the village and on a road with the mountains stretching before them in a magnificent panorama that Nash mentioned Lefty's indignant visit. "Your friend Burke seems to think I have no right to your acquaintance," Nash informed her. "He came to see me yesterday and spoke his mind rather freely." "What?" she exclaimed. "He came to see you about me? He must be crazy." He was. One of the craziest men I ever saw. He told me he was engaged to marry you, and that I, being a stranger not entirely above suspicion, must have nothing more to do with you. What business is it of his?" She cried angrily. "I thought he had more sense. I'll have to have a talk with Lefty about this. He's got to understand that I'm my own boss." "So you're really engaged to marry that man?" Nash sighed dismally. "Oh, I suppose so," she returned. "In spite of his faults, I'm fond of Lefty." For Nash, the scenery held no interest. His mind was consumed with the problem of how to get rid of Lefty Burke. And then there was the problem of Marland. Not only Burke, but the old man too stood in his way of winning this girl. To steal her from Burke might not be too difficult, But what would be the use of winning a girl whose father might disinherit her or tie up her money so that her husband would never be able to touch a dollar of it? "Dad starts for California tomorrow morning," she informed him when they had exhausted the subject of Burke's interference. "I hope that doesn't mean you're going back to Boston," he said anxiously. "No, I'll stay here. It's going to be a hurried trip, and he'll be back very soon. We always keep the Northborough house open until the snow begins to fly." Nash, who for a moment had felt his chance of winning the Marland millions slipping away, sighed with relief. "When he's gone, I'll invite you to the house," she said. "If Lefty objects, we'll just tell him to go jump on himself." "He's more likely to jump on me," Nash remarked with a frown. "Well, you have as much right there as he has," she returned with a toss of her head. "He's been forbidden to come, and since Dad stays up until all hours of the night, poor Lefty has to stay away." "So your father is a night owl," Nash muttered thoughtfully. "Always has been. Never goes to bed before midnight, no matter how early he gets up." Nash tucked this scrap of information away in his mind as something worth remembering. Presently, his thoughts returned to his perplexing problems. During the remainder of the ride, he was unusually silent. A vague idea had taken possession of him, and it slowly began to take shape. It was an idea so sinister and desperate that it frightened him at first, but he refused to let it go. By the time they returned to the tavern, he had considered it so carefully in every detail, and found it so flawless, that his fear had subsided. He was now convinced that he had found a way out of his difficulties. Half an hour after parting from Jane Marland, he stepped into the public phone booth in the drugstore and called the office of Lefty Burke. The drugstore booth was used so frequently and by so many strangers on their way through the village that he knew the call would never be traced to himself. It was Burke who answered him. The young real estate dealer, when in his office, was usually alone, for he had neither stenographer nor clerk and few visitors. "My name is Johnson," said Nash, disguising his voice. "I want to buy a farm, and I understand you've got some for sale, but I can't get over to see you until 9 o'clock tonight. Can you meet me at that time at your office? It may be too late to see the properties, but I can look over your lists and maps, and maybe I can get a pretty good idea from you of what you've got to offer." Lefty, who had scarcely ever kept his little office open so late as 9 o'clock, was under the impression that the stranger, Johnson, was calling from some distant town. "I'll be there," he agreed, elated at the prospect of making a sale. At a few minutes before 9, Lefty strolled down the road to the isolated little shanty where he conducted his business. It was late for Northborough, and the streets were deserted. The office was dark and silent. He pulled out his key and opened the door. He was groping for the light switch when there was a sudden stir in the darkness, and a blow from something blunt and heavy knocked him senseless. When at last he returned to consciousness, he discovered that his hands and feet were securely bound, and there was a gag in his mouth. He could not even move his arms, which were fastened tightly to his sides, with ropes wound around his body. His limbs were numb, almost without feeling, so tight were his bonds. The office was pitch dark, and there was not a sound. He was too weak and dazed even to attempt to free himself. After what seemed like a long time, he heard the door open, and somebody came in. He caught glimpses of the indistinct figure of a man who presently bent over him. The man's face seemed to be masked, but it was so dark that to Lefty he was no more than a shadow. Suddenly he caught the nauseating odor of chloroform. A cloth saturated with the drug was being pressed to his nose, and in a few moments he slipped again into unconsciousness. Then, once more, his senses returned. The night had not passed, for there was not even a glimmer of light, but he had no idea of the hour. To his surprise, he discovered that he was free. The gag and the ropes had been removed. Dizzily, he staggered up to his feet. After a moment, he found the electric button and flooded the place with light. He was alone, and the ropes and the gag had disappeared completely. Not the slightest evidence remained of what had happened to him, The windows were closed and locked. There was no sign of burglary. The lock of the door, however, was a simple one, and he knew that anybody with experience at that sort of thing could have picked it easily. If it were not for a splitting headache and the lingering odor of chloroform, he would almost have believed the whole affair had been only a dream. It was hard to convince himself even now that it had really happened. It was so inexplicable, so preposterous. When presently he discovered that neither his watch nor his money had been taken and that the papers on his desk had not been disturbed, his perplexity grew. It seemed as if the attack upon him must have been the act of a maniac. "I guess I'd better keep my mouth shut about this," he decided, "or the whole village will be laughing at me. They'll say I dreamed it. I haven't got a darned thing to prove it except a bump on my head, which may be gone by morning." He looked at his watch. It was almost 1 o'clock. He turned out the light, and finding his key in the pocket where he had placed it after letting himself in, locked the place up. With his thoughts in wild confusion, he made his way back to the Pine Tree Tavern. Entering the lobby, he saw Rufus Bagley drowsing in the office as he waited for the arrival of the stage from the railroad. "You're keeping pretty bad hours," Rufus observed sleepily as he opened one eye at Lefty. "It looks that way, don't it?" Lefty returned and passed on to the stairs and up to his room. He was so dizzy that he could scarcely pull off his clothes, but at last, after much effort, he got into his pajamas and crept into bed. "Not necessarily," said Wade. Marland was probably leaning far forward over his work. In that case, a killer. Instead of reaching far over the tall back of the chair and striking from above, would have found it easier to bend his knees a little and strike around the back of the chair from his hip. In that case, the hilt would be almost horizontal with the floor, just as it is now. It was certainly a left-handed blow, Chief. You can't reason that fact away. Sheriff Hawley nodded his approval. "You can step to the head of the class, Jim. You're a bright young fella." The deputy had been holding back a surprise to reveal at some moment when it would be most effective. He felt that moment had now arrived. "And I can show you something else to prove that the killer was left-handed," he announced, narrowing his eyes at Hawley. "Something that's going to give you a jolt, Chief." As Hawley stared at him with a puzzled frown, Wade produced a small pocket memorandum book with the name Samuel E. Burke printed in gilt letters on its morocco cover. "That's Lefty's," he whispered. "I found it lying on the floor up against this open window." "Lefty Burke," exclaimed Hawley with a start. "Oh no, Jim. I can't believe he's guilty of this job." "I'm not accusing him, not yet," said Wade, "but that book is his all right. It's full of scribbled memoranda, and I recognize the handwriting. Maybe he'll be able to offer some explanation plausible enough to make things look less black for him. But all the same, I think we'd better take a look at Lefty's shoes." It's certainly strange that that book should be found here under that window only a few steps from the body, when Marland, as everybody around here knows, has forbidden him the house. "It would take considerable to make me believe Lefty Burke did this," the sheriff declared, shaking his head sadly. "It was probably the work of a sneak thief, Jim." Wade gave a nod of assent. "It certainly was, Chief, for Marland has been robbed." "Of what?" the sheriff demanded, with a little upward jerk of his head. "Money. Ferguson, the cashier of the bank, came around here cross lots a little while ago from his home on the other side of the hill. He thought I'd be interested to learn that Marland drew $1,500 from the bank yesterday. There isn't any safe in this house. Marland always kept his money in his pocketbook in an inside pocket of his coat. That pocketbook has disappeared. It's hard to believe Lefty would commit murder merely to steal $1,500. But, Chief, I've got to remind you that Marland's death may bring Burke's reach nearer 15 millions than 1,500s. Remember, he's engaged to Marland's daughter, and the old man has threatened that, if she married him, he'd cut her off without a cent. He can't cut her off now. The millions are already hers. She can marry Lefty Burke whenever she wants to." Hawley gave a shrug of his heavy shoulders. "Jim, I hope you're not hinting that Jane Marland might have had something to do with this job, not hinting anything against anybody. his deputy assured him bluntly. "Just stating facts, that's all. Would a man aiming at millions waste time looking for a pocketbook?" said Hawley. "He might," Wade insisted, "if he was in desperate need of a little money. It's common talk that Lefty's up against it hard, that he's in debt, that sometimes he can't even pay his hotel bill." Though Luther Hawley knew most of the people of Northborough, he lived too far away to hear much of the latest gossip about their private affairs, and this information seemed to surprise him. "I didn't know that," he muttered gravely, and after a moment he added, "I think we ought to have a talk with Jane Marland." "Well, I wanted to," returned Wade, "but she's naturally all broken up over this, and the butler said she ought not to be disturbed. What's happened to your fingerprint man, Chief, with his camera?" Hawley was proud of his fingerprint outfit, which he had recently persuaded parsimonious county supervisors to buy for him, and in his haste to get away to Northborough, he hadn't forgotten about it. "He'll be over pretty soon, I guess," he answered. "I couldn't wait for him, but we won't find any prints on the hilt of that knife. It's rough bone. There's not a smooth spot on it. After he's hunted for fingerprints, he can photograph those shoe prints outside, and then we'll make plaster casts of them. But I'm going to see Jane Marland right now, Jim, no matter how bad she feels." With a look of fierce determination, the sheriff started off to look for the butler. Wade followed him. As they stepped into the big square entrance hall in front of the house, Hawley stopped abruptly, for to his surprise, he had caught sight of Jane Marland, whom he was so eager to interview, coming down the broad staircase. As might have been expected, she still showed signs of the shock her father's death must have been to her, but though she was very pale and her eyes were swollen and tear-stained, she seemed to have herself under firm control. As she reached the foot of the stairs, Hawley stepped forward to intercept her. "I don't like to trouble you at such a time, Miss Marland," he explained softly, "but before I go any further with this case, there are some questions I've got to ask you." There were but few people in the county who did not know Luther Hawley, at least by sight, and the girl recognized him. For a moment she studied his face anxiously and seemed uncertain what answer to make. "What is it you want to ask me?" she said at last. "I want to know whether you saw Lefty Burke here last night," he replied grimly. The girl, quick to sense the suspicion in his mind, gave a slight start. His sharp, searching look seemed to shake her nerves. I don't understand what you mean, Sheriff," she stammered after a moment. "Surely you don't think—" The sentence remained unfinished, and she stared past him through the wide-open front door at a handsome, smartly dressed man who had just come up the steps. "You must excuse me, Sheriff," she said quickly. "There is somebody I must see at once." As she hurried to the door, Hawley swung around to see who was there. He had never seen the man before, but Wade had seen him several times and had heard his name. He recognized him now as Archibald Ely Nash. Chapter 7. Lefty Burke's Shoes. As the circumstances seemed to demand of him, Nash's face was very grave, and his manner subdued as he grasped the welcoming hand Jane Marland extended in greeting. "It was good of you to come," she murmured. "I couldn't stay away," he said, looking sadly into her eyes. "I scarcely expected to see you, but I felt that I must call and at least leave my name and my deepest sympathy." Nash, who had developed his natural social gifts by careful study of the ways of the fashionable world, was one of the most tactful of men. Though he was eager for information concerning the ghostly happenings of the night before, he waited silently for the girl herself to speak of it of her own volition. He did not have long to wait, for, as he stepped into the hall, Jane whispered to him, "That big man at the foot of the stairs is Sheriff Hawley, and I'm afraid he means to make himself very disagreeable. I don't want to speak with him. For some reason or other, I believe he suspects Lefty. Only a moment ago he asked me if he was here last night." "The man must be a fool," Nash muttered. "Don't worry about Burke. But if I were you, I'd answer the sheriff's questions. If you don't, You will only increase whatever suspicion he may have." "Oh, I am so glad you are here," she exclaimed under her breath. "If you will stay by me, I'll talk with the man and won't feel so much afraid of him." Leading Nash over to the foot of the stairs, she introduced him to the sheriff. "Mr. Nash is a good friend of mine," she explained, "and he thinks I ought to answer whatever questions you want to ask. I might as well tell you right now that I didn't see Lefty Burke here last night, that he hasn't been here for weeks." "No?" said Hawley incredulously. He turned his eyes to Nash. "I've just been told by Mr. Wade here that you're staying at the tavern. Did you see Burke last night?" For a moment, Nash kept an awkward silence. "See here, Sheriff, I don't want to say anything that might get Burke mixed up in this affair," he burst out, his face full of trouble. "Which means, I suppose, that you do know something that might mix him up in it," the sheriff persisted with keener interest. "Tell me the truth, Nash. It's bound to come out sometime. You did see Burke last night. Where and when?" Nash hesitated over his reply. "It's better to tell what little I know," he decided suddenly. "It's impossible that Burke could have been connected with such a terrible crime as this, and no matter what I or anybody else can say, his innocence is sure to come out. Usually I go out for a little stroll before going to bed. Last night, about 11 o'clock, I was passing the Marland grounds and was nearing the gate when I saw Burke coming toward me. I spoke to him, but he didn't answer." "Did he come out of that gate?" Hawley demanded quickly. "I don't suppose so. I don't know where he came from." The sheriff's eyes were bright with suddenly aroused excitement. "Jim, let's see that book," he snapped. He reached out and seized the pocket memorandum book that Wade produced. "Look at the name on this, Miss Marland. It was found this morning, lying on the floor just inside the open window of the library. It belongs to Burke. Can you explain how it got there?" Jane looked at the name on the cover and gasped. "Why, it's impossible," she cried, her eyes wide with amazement. "He hasn't been here, I tell you, for weeks." For several seconds, Hawley stared into her face without a word. "Well, all right," he sighed at last, plainly doubting her. "We'll let it go at that. But Jim, go find Lefty Burke and bring him here. And if he isn't wearing shoes with fancy rubber soles, go to his room and look for a pair that has them." As Wade passed out of the house, Nash noticed that the girl's nerves were in a bad state, and he turned to her with a look of sympathy. "Come away, Miss Marland. You can't stand any more of this." "No, no," she cried. "I've got to see this through. I've got to wait here for Lefty." Though it had seemed certain that if Lefty were in the village, he would be found very quickly, it proved to be a long wait. But at last, they saw him coming up the steps of the house in charge of the deputy. Apparently, Wade had not taken any shoes from Lefty's room, for there was nothing in his hands. The young real estate dealer looked completely bewildered. As he stepped into the house and saw the three persons who were waiting there for him, his eyes widened, and he stared blankly at their grave faces. "Well, Jim," snapped the sheriff impatiently, "what's the answer?" Wade scowled. "Knowing Burke, I hate to say it, Chief, but those shoes he's wearing seem to have the kind of soles we want. But we'll know in a minute. We'd better take him around outside to those prints under the windows." Presently, as the two officers led Burke out of the house and around toward the garden in the rear, Jane Marland started to follow them. Nash protested, for he could see that she was under an intense strain, but she persisted stubbornly, and they went along together to the spot marked by the steps of the man who, sometime in the dead of night, had come to Marland's library. As they arrived at the garden bed where the footprints were so clearly visible, Lefty, with the two officers standing beside him, was sitting on the ground, taking off his shoes. With fast-growing impatience, Hawley seized the first shoe to come off and, holding it carefully over one of the footprints in the earth, found that it fitted the mark exactly. He turned the shoe over and studied the design of circles and crosses on the sole. It was a design that had its exact counterpart in the imprint in the earth, even to the places where the rubber had been slightly worn away by use. Jane Marland saw everything. She saw how perfectly the sole of Lefty's shoe fitted the imprint. And suddenly all her sympathy for the young man she was engaged to marry vanished. "You," she cried, staring at him with flashing eyes. "I couldn't believe it. I never could have believed but for this." Her voice sank into a sobbing whisper. "But now I know." Stepping up to Burke, Sheriff Hawley pointed a long, accusing finger into his face. "Tell the truth," he roared. "You did it. You can't deny it. You're the man who crept into this house last night and killed Andrew J. Marland. There's no getting away from it, Burke. Look at this." He held up the little memorandum book before Lefty's eyes. "It's yours. It was found inside that open window." Lefty tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His eyes, with a wild, baffled look in them now, turned to Jane. Her nerves had broken at last, and she was sobbing bitterly. Archibald Ely Nash had fondly thrown a long, slender arm around her shoulders, the arm with the wristwatch. Chapter 8. The Clinching Story. Ever since the days when they had been friends and classmates in school, Lorna Sherwood had cherished a romantic attachment for Lefty Burke. Nobody ever suspected it, not even Lefty himself. She would never have dared speak of it to anybody. But that little secret love affair, coming into her drab life, had made the world brighter for her, had lifted her thoughts above the dull routine of household chores and her work in her father's store. To her quiet brown eyes, Lefty was a hero, a wonder man, the embodiment of all the gifts the gods have to offer to poor humanity. She hadn't seen him very often of late, but she liked to let her thoughts wander back to the old winter days when he had drawn her to school on his sled, and to the old summers when they had gone to the mill pond together, and he had taught her how to swim and to fish and to row a boat. Even now he was her idol. She had never really believed he would ever fall in love with her, for she did not rate herself very highly, and she had accepted his engagement to Jane Marland without a touch of bitterness. It was the greatest shock of her life when Lefty was arrested for the murder of Jane Marland's father. The whole village might believe him guilty. In fact, most of the village did believe so already, but she herself would never doubt him, no matter what the evidence might be. Lorna had formed some specific ideas of her own concerning the murder of Marland, and these ideas all directed her suspicion to one man. That man was Archibald Ely Nash. She had felt a sudden dislike for the Adonis of the tavern the very moment she first set eyes on him. A keenly intuitive girl, she had been quick to sense the evil nature that lurked behind the disguise of his handsome, alluring face. A logical process of reasoning told her that Nash had plenty of motive, not only for killing Marland, but for fastening the crime on Lefty. She knew that Jane was ignoring Lefty in his cell in the village jail, that she had turned against him, and that Nash was paying her devoted attention. Marland, who would have bitterly opposed the smooth stranger's wooing of his daughter, was out of the way, and Lefty was no longer to be feared. That Nash might have had strong reason to get rid of both men was obvious to Lorna, but apparently to nobody else. Now that her father was dead, the headstrong Jane was her own boss. She could see Nash wherever and whenever she pleased. Lefty was no longer an obstacle to be reckoned with. For the Adonis of the tavern, the way was clear, and tactful, sympathetic, of polished manners and clever speech, he was making the best of his opportunities. Two other men besides Nash were the recipients of Lorna's bitter animosity, Sheriff Hawley and his deputy, Jim Wade. She was convinced that the two officers were prejudiced against their prisoner, and were ignoring every fact that might point to his innocence. She had to acknowledge to herself, however, that those facts were very few, and seemed to be completely outweighed by the evidence that had been presented, and that was continuing to accumulate against her idol. The case of the prosecution was even stronger now than at the time of Lefty's arrest, for the weapon with which Marland had been killed had been identified as Lefty's hunting knife. Lefty's own story was too fantastic for general belief. He had told at last of how he had been attacked in his office and left bound and unconscious. He had argued that his shoes could have been removed from his feet at that time without his knowledge, that they could have been worn by his assailant to Marlon's house, and then, after the murder, could have been put back on his own feet. And he had explained how easy it would have been for anybody to steal his hunting knife from his room in the tavern. But the village was laughing at the prisoner's incredible story, and convinced at last that he was the unfortunate victim of a perfect frame-up, he had given way to absolute despair. Lorna was feeling pretty desperate herself. Almost convinced of Nash's guilt, she had been seeking some way of launching an attack upon him that would bring him under general suspicion. She had been watching him like a hawk at every opportunity. Remembering all the details of the murder, she had hoped to find he was left-handed. In that effort, she had been sharply disappointed, for the evidence all seemed to point the other way. She had found that he wrote with his right hand and seemed to use it at all times in preference to his left. The morning of the day after Lefty's arrest, Nash called on Seth Sherwood in his little office in the rear of the store. After the man had gone, Lorna, observing her father's agitation, was deeply perplexed. She had not forgotten how troubled her father had seemed after the first visit Nash had paid him, and now the same thing had happened again. A few hours later, Sheriff Hawley came into the store. Ignoring Lorna, he passed on into the office, where he found Sherwood at his desk. "I hear you've been looking for me, that you've got something important to tell," Hawley began. The storekeeper was looking thoroughly miserable. His face was white and drawn, and his weak eyes were full of anxiety. "I'm afraid I have," he answered, drawing a hand across his forehead. "I've hated to tell you, Hawley, and it's all I can do to bring myself to it now, for I've known Lefty Burke for years and have never heard anything against him." Hawley glanced at him with suddenly quickened interest. "So you know something against Burke, eh? What is it?" I saw him, Hawley, that night that Marland was killed," the storekeeper stammered with very obvious reluctance. He paused, frowned, and bit at his lips as if he already repented his words. "Go on, Sherwood. When and where did you see him?" "You know my house isn't very far from the Marland grounds," Sherwood resumed with an effort. "Well, there was a letter I'd forgotten to open, and I'd left it here in my desk. I didn't think of it till late in the evening, and then it began to worry me. I thought it might be something important, and I felt that I couldn't sleep till I had looked at it. So I came down here and got it. I was on my way home, and was almost there, when I saw a man climbing over the Marland wall. He dropped to the path right in front of me. It was Burke. My eyesight isn't very good, but I was so close I couldn't mistake him. It must have been about 11 o'clock, and I asked him what he was doing out so late in the Marland grounds. He didn't seem to be quite himself. He seemed dazed. He told me a rambling story about how he'd been drinking some bootleg whiskey, and he said he hadn't any idea how he got into Marland's grounds. I left him there and went on home. For a few moments the sheriff pondered the old man's story in silence, until at last a slow smile lit up his face. "We've got him, Sherwood. We've got him dead to rights now. That's the clinching story. It means a death sentence for Lefty Burke." The smile was lingering on the sheriff's face when a little later, leaving Sherwood at his desk, he stepped out into the store. Hawley was a changeable sort of man, though he had not been ready to believe in Lefty's guilt at first, after he was convinced of it by the evidence of the shoes. His former friendly feeling for the young real estate dealer turned into contempt, and he had been finding a grim satisfaction in the accumulating evidence. In his cheerful frame of mind, he did not ignore Lorna after leaving her father's office. She was standing behind one of the counters, and he stopped to speak to her. "What are you smiling so happily about, Sheriff?" she asked. "I've just heard some pretty good news, Lorna," he replied. "Your father's been talking with me about Lefty Burke." Lorna could scarcely conceal her sudden excitement, but she made an effort to show indifference. "Oh, I can guess what he's been telling you," she said with a shrug. "He doesn't keep any secrets from me." "That so?" The sheriff was in a talkative mood, and he had no very strong reason for keeping his fresh information to himself. It would come out in court pretty soon, and he thought that probably the girl had heard the story from her father already. "So you know about Lefty climbing over the Marland wall on the night of the murder?" Lorna's wits were wide awake. "I heard something about it. Just what did my father tell you? His memory isn't very good, and perhaps I can supply some details he's forgotten." "Why, he told me about how he came down here to the store late that night to get something, and, on his way home, saw Burke climbing out of the Marland grounds. Lefty told him he'd been drinking and didn't know how he got there. It's the clinching story, Lorna, coming from a man of your father's importance in the village. What he says, a jury will believe. We don't need anything more now to convict Burke of first-degree murder." Lorna believed that Hawley, for some reason she could not fathom, was lying to her. It was impossible for her to believe her father had told such a story. But she was trembling when, presently, the sheriff passed out into the street. She rushed into the office. "Father, what did you tell the sheriff just now?" she demanded. "Oh, nothing of any importance, Lorna," he replied nervously. "He says you saw Lefty climbing over the Marland wall that night. He says you told him so." Sherwood knew the whole village would know his story before long. He wouldn't be able to keep it from Lorna much longer. "I had to tell him what I saw," he muttered, turning his eyes away from her. "You told him that?" "Yes, told him everything." "You deliberately told him that? Father, why did you have to tell such a lie?" "For it was a lie. You were with me at home all that evening. You know you were. You didn't leave the house for a moment." Sherwood looked as if he were in agony. "Lorna," he cried desperately, "I had to tell that story. There's a reason I can't talk about. A reason for telling a lie that will convict Lefty of murder." Sherwood had reached the limit of endurance. Suddenly, his quivering nerves seemed to break, and a long-drawn sob broke from his lips as he covered his bowed face with his hands. "I was forced to tell it," he whimpered. "Yes, forced. There's nothing about my past life that I must hide from you, Lorna, but I've got to stick to that lie or spend the rest of my life in prison." His long shirt sleeve had slipped back from his right wrist, exposing the brand of the handcuff. Lorna had seen that ugly, strange scar several times before and had often wondered about it. But she stared at it now with fresh curiosity. For years, she had suspected that there was some cloud over her father's past, but not until this moment had she felt certain that Archibald Ely Nash was connected with it. "Was it Nash who forced you to tell that lie?" she demanded. "He's been squeezing money from me, Lorna. Today he came and promised he'd never ask me for another $1 if I'd tell that story about Burke. But if I refused, he'd expose me, would tell everything he knew about me. I'm helpless, Lorna, and so are you. If you tell that I lied, it will be the end of me. I've got to testify against Burke in court, or Nash will have me sent to prison for 20 years. Into his daughter's face came a look of fierce determination such as he had never seen there before. Her eyes flashed, and her little fists were clenched tightly. "Father, would prison be any worse than the torment you'd have all the rest of your life when you realized you'd told a lie that had sent an innocent man to death? You've got to tell the truth. If you don't, I'll have a story of my own to tell in court. A true story." Chapter 9. The Saving Lie. The covetous hands of Archibald Ely Nash were drawing closer and closer to the Marland millions. The Woolen King's will disclosed the fact that he had left his entire estate to his daughter. Moreover, it had become obvious to the whole village that the mysterious Adonis of the tavern, about whose past nobody seemed to know anything, had completely won Jane Marland's affections. The spell that Nash exercised over the girl was almost hypnotic. He knew that, after she became his wife, he would find a way of doing as he pleased with her property. He had already made the pleasing discovery that Jane didn't have much of a head for business. The tragic death of Marland and the pitiful plight of Burke did not cause him any loss of sleep. In fact, he found amusement in the thought that, while his former rival for Jane's affections was behind prison bars and would probably never be free again, He could look forward to a life of luxurious ease. Not only had Lefty been abandoned by Jane Marland in his time of trouble, but by almost everybody in the village. He had begun to believe that not one human being believed in his innocence, and that he was doomed to die. Against the mass of evidence pointing to his guilt, he felt that his case was hopeless. He scarcely expected that anybody would come to see him in his lonely prison through mere friendship, sympathy, or faith in him. When one morning he discovered Lorna Sherwood standing at the door of his cell, his heart leaped. "Oh, Lefty, I simply had to come to tell you I still believe in you, no matter what people are saying," she burst out, her voice trembling with emotion. He had scarcely spoken with Lorna for months, but now suddenly his thoughts went back to the old days when they were boy and girl together. The realization that there was at least one human being who believed in him gave him a thrill. "Dear little Lorna," he cried, "you're the truest friend I've got in the world. You always did believe in me. When we were kids together, you thought I was going to be a great man someday. I've been an awful disappointment, haven't I? It looks as if they've got me. There doesn't seem to be any hope for me at all right now." "I can't stay long," she hastened to tell him. "The jailer won't let me. But I don't want you to give up hope. I've thought of a way to help you. I can't tell you what it is, but it's something that may set you free." For a moment, Lefty stared out at her through the bars with wondering eyes. Then he gave a bitter little laugh. "Why, poor little girl, there's nothing that can set me free, nothing that you could do anyhow." "You're wrong, Lefty," she insisted. "You don't know what I'm thinking about. I really have found a way." She was so very serious about it, and seemed so confident that his curiosity was stirred. "Tell me, Lorna," he urged. "You don't mean you found some kind of evidence that's been overlooked?" "But I can't tell you," she replied with a frown. After a moment of thought, she added, "But yes, I'll tell you this much. I'm going to lie for you, Lefty. Yes, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell a lie that will smash that whole case of Luther Hawley's to smithereens." Leaving Lefty completely bewildered, she went away to look for Sheriff Hawley at the town hall, where he made his headquarters during his stay in the village. She found him before long at an opportune moment, for he was alone in a little room with a desk. "I never expected you to honor me with a visit," he told her gallantly. "What's on your mind, Lorna? Got something to add to your father's story?" "There's not a word of truth in my father's story," she said, looking Hawley squarely in the eyes. "He told me himself it was a lie. And before long, he's going to be telling you the same thing. You'll never have him as a witness against Lefty Burke." Hawley was startled. "A lie?" he exclaimed. "Why, Lorna, it's hard to believe you. Why would he tell such a lie as that?" "Because that man, Archibald Ely Nash, told him to," she answered promptly. "He's a blackmailer. He knows about something, I don't know what, connected with my father's past, and he's been holding it over him. He's been squeezing money from him. Nash promised that he'd never ask him for another $1 if father would tell that story, and father had to tell it, for he knew that if he didn't, something terrible would happen to him. Sheriff, I've come to tell you that you've been on the wrong track in this case right from the start. You fell for the neatest frame-up that was ever put over on an innocent man. You never could see that Nash had a bigger motive than anybody in the world for killing Mr. Marland. He was after Marland's daughter and Marland's millions, and he had to frame Lefty to get him out of the way." Now, Lorna," the sheriff protested. "You ought not to say things like that. You can't accuse Nash with no more evidence than the fact that he's on friendly terms with Jane Marland." "I've got more evidence than that," Lorna assured him. "I've got evidence, Mr. Hawley. That's going to make you do a lot of deep thinking pretty soon. You never found the money that disappeared from Mr. Marland's pocket, did you?" The sheriff seemed to be slightly puzzled. "I don't see what you're trying to show," he said, scowling and stroking his chin. "We've got all the case we need against Burke, even if we never find that money." Lorna was in no hurry to satisfy his curiosity. "The last time Mr. Ferguson, the bank cashier, was in the store," she said, "he told me that money was in brand new bills, and that he happened to remember the numbers, because the first 4 figures of the first number were the date of his birth, and the rest were ciphers. Of course, when he had the number of the bill on the top of the pack in his mind, he knew what the numbers of the others were, for in a new pack they ran consecutively. "Yes, we've got the numbers," Hawley admitted. "But what of it?" "Just this, Mr. Hawley. I've got some of that money, and I know the man who paid it to me in the store." From her purse, she took a new $50 bill and held it before the sheriff's eyes. "Do you remember the number, Sheriff?" "It's one of those that's on your list." Hawley's eyes widened. "Where did that come from?" he demanded nervously. "From Archibald Ely Nash," Lorna answered. "This morning he bought some handkerchiefs in the store. He said that was the smallest money he'd got, so I had to change it for him. It seems to me, Sheriff, that it's up to you to take a look inside Nash's pocketbook, where you may find 29 other new $50 bills." The sheriff was too deep in thought to speak. The whole structure of the case he had built up so carefully against Lefty Burke seemed suddenly threatened with destruction. Presently he rose from his chair. "I think I'll take your advice, Lorna," he said sheepishly. "I'm going out right now to look for that man Nash." What happened subsequently? The finding of the remainder of the missing money in Nash's room, the arrest of Nash for murder, Seth Sherwood's confession that his story of seeing Burke climbing Marland's wall was a lie, was a sensational series of events in the history of Northborough. The sending of Nash's fingerprints to the police of the big cities of the country resulted in the discovery of his criminal career and of the fact that he was wanted as a swindler in several places. The faith of the village in Lefty returned with surprising suddenness, and his story was no longer doubted. In fact, in the light of what had been discovered about Nash, the story seemed so perfectly plausible from beginning to end that people began to wonder why Luther Hawley and Jim Wade had ignored it so completely. Presumably, Nash had gone to Marland's house in Lefty's shoes, taking with him Lefty's hunting knife and memorandum book. The finding of a blackjack among Nash's possessions provided a theory that he had first knocked Marland unconscious with a blow on the head, and that he had then had time to strike a blow with the knife. That would appear to have been dealt by a left-handed man. Of course, there was no proof of this, and there never would be unless Nash should confess. But the smooth-tongued adventurer was not that kind of a man. There was only one confession he made: suicide. "And that's confession enough to satisfy anybody," observed Luther Hawley. To find himself suddenly facing the certainty of conviction, either for Marland's murder or on many other charges when his hands had been so close to millions, had been too much of a shock to the Adonis of the tavern. He was found hanging from the bars of his cell in a strangling noose, which he had made from strips of bedclothing. When at last Lefty Burke was set free, he went at once to Seth Sherwood's store, where he found Lorna alone. "Can you guess why I've come here, little girl?" he asked her. "No, Lefty, I don't think I can," she answered, looking up into his face and trying to keep back the tears that were brimming in her brown eyes. He took her into his big arms and held her close, and presently he whispered into her ear, "I know now that I've always loved you, Lorna, ever since we were kids. But I'm an awful liar, Lefty," she sobbed. "It wasn't Nash who gave me that $50 bill. It was Mr. Marland." She was still in Lefty's arms when Seth Sherwood stepped out of his office and blinked curiously at them from behind his spectacles. But there was no sign of recognition in his weak eyes until he had drawn very near. Then he saw how things were between his daughter and Lefty Burke, and he smiled happily. Without saying a word, he went back to his office. He no longer feared any immediate exposure of his past. Archibald Ely Nash, too busy with his own troubles to have room in his mind for any petty spite, had failed to betray him, and Luther Hawley, whatever he might suspect, had not the least desire to dig back into the years in an effort to bring ruin to one of Northborough's leading citizens. For a long time the old man sat dreaming at his desk. At last he opened his eyes, pulled back the sleeve of his shirt, and stared wide-eyed at the scar on his wrist. The brand of the Fetters. he whispered to himself. I'll never be free from that. Someday they may find me, and they'll know me by that mark. It's my punishment. With that mark, fear will always be with me to the end of my life. End of Brand of the Fetters by Edward Leonard.